Good morning. This is Jason Bowsey with DPS. I'm going to go ahead and get started with today's meeting. Appreciate everyone joining. Can everyone hear me all right, first to start with?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. And can everyone see the screen as far as the JU presentation?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. So this is our second meeting for our distribution planning subgroup. We had a meeting back on June 2nd to start with, and I think we had good discussions on this topic, and it was very productive. As an outset of that meeting, we had put together some specific questions. There were 3 specific questions that we had proposed, from the discussions at the June 2nd meeting for the JU. And since that time, the JU have been working to put together this presentation and their response to those 3 questions. And I think that we've had some conversations with them on the side a little bit and making sure that they're covering the main areas that everyone is interested in. So I think that they put together a pretty good presentation. It was posted. I did send it around to everyone on the invite list yesterday. So hopefully people had a chance to take a look at it. We are going to put this material also up on the DPS website in the Clcpa link there. So we'll be posting it there as well. To start with, why don't we do I just want to make sure we've got about 32 people on the line. I don't want to go through everybody, but I did want to kind of go through a kind of targeted roll call. And I'm going to start with the JU primary contacts, or just kind of speak up if you're with one of the utilities. I'll start calling out. So, is anyone on from PSEG Long Island? Nicole?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Jason. This is Ahmed from PSNG Long Island.
Okay. And who else mentioned that they were there?
I'm sorry. Good morning, Jason. This is Annie.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm pretty sure I saw Stephanie. Is any Stephanie Palmer from Central Hudson, or anybody else from Central Hudson?
Stephanie's here. Hello.
Yeah, John Borchertown.
John, how are you? And how about Con Edison?
Hey, Jason, Jared's on.
Jared, thank you. And how about Orange and Rockland? Is Tom Brown on?
Yeah, good morning, Jason. Tom Brown's here.
Perfect. And National Grid, is Tom Vaccaro on?
Yep, this is Tom Vaccaro, and I have Doug Ayer in the room with me, too, from National Grid.
Perfect, thank you. And how about from NYSEG Argini representation?
On. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Tim. How are you?
Romero's on.
Great, thank you. Let me just go down. How about from either any other DPS or state entity representatives on?
Hi, this is Andy Owens.
Hi, Andy. Thank you. Okay.
Jason, you got Shyam at there from NYSERDA.
Oh, great. Thanks, Shyam. All right. And then I just kind of want to go through the stakeholder list that at least I have, and then I can ask if there are any others that I don't call out. Is Brandon Smithwood on? No. Okay. How about anyone from Borrego, Cat? No. Okay. Ed Brolin from Con Ed CEB?
Yes, I'm on. Thank you. I thought I saw Kat earlier, but yeah.
I'm looking.
I think she's on.
New Leaf.
That is with New Leaf now, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And is Greg on? Greg Sachs?
Hey guys, good to see you.
Hey, Greg. And I'm pretty sure I saw Bill Acker as well.
Yep. Hi, Jason. I'm on.
Good morning. And just heard Zach is on from Nicaea as well.
Jason, thanks.
Yep. And Dhruv as well.
Hi, Jason. Yeah, I'm on.
Great. Is anybody on from New York City? Okay. And how about Danny Wagner?
Hi, this is Danny Wagner. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you, Danny. And how about Valessa from SIA?
I'm on, Jason. Hey.
Great. Thank you. Any other developer, industry, interested stakeholder people that I didn't mention other than JU and state entities?
Hey, Jason, this is Caitlin Kelly O'Neill from the Coalition for Community Solar Access.
Okay.
Hey, good morning, Jason. This is Mike Fingar from US Light Energy. Also have Mark Richardson on the line from US Light Energy.
Morning, everybody.
Hey, Mike. Anybody else? Okay, great. So I think we have a very good list and good coverage by everybody. Appreciate that. As I had started out with, this is kind of a follow-up from our June 2nd meeting. We're going to be going through the presentation that the JU put together, along with the questions and other information that I think is going to be very helpful. So we're going to start with that, but I just did want to mention that there was a kind of a third or last agenda item that was I brought up new to the group, and it was kind of with discussions that I had with Liz Grisero here at DPS, as far as we want to kind of wrap up today with an open discussion on thoughts and concerns or input from anybody, from JU, industry stakeholders, on improving the transparency and reporting of the planned utility infrastructure expansion efforts. I think it's an important aspect as far as how we're kind of going through the nuts and bolts of what's going to be done, but as far as relaying that information out to the public and out to the developers and interested stakeholders is a very important part. It would be an initial discussion on it, and I think it's more to kind of just put it out there and have folks start thinking about it and how we can incorporate improvements into that process going forward. So that's kind of the last agenda item that I was planning to go through today. Any questions as far as what we're going to plan to cover today or before we get started? And as you had heard, hopefully, I am recording this session, and we will plan to post that recording to the website, and I'll share it with the group as well as we had done last time so that everyone has the transcript. Okay, great. So with that, I'm going to, am I turning it over to Stephanie? It looks like she might have been one of the first presenters, or to someone from the JU to kick off.
I'll kick it off, Jason. Thanks.
And just let me know. I can scroll through the screen. Just let me know when to move forward.
Sure. Actually, if you want to go to the next slide. So first, I'm Stephanie Palmer. I'm the Director of Electric Planning and Interconnections at Central Hudson. And so today we got a bunch of topics to go over. I'm really going to start out at a high level of going over the evolution of the distribution planning process, and specifically some of the areas that are changing. And then there's others, Jared, Tom Brown, Tom Vaccaro, are going to get really more into the details of those specific areas. There was also 3 specific questions that we had received, which we're hoping that part of this presentation will help answer those questions, but we do have time at the end for Tom Vaccaro to go over those questions in more detail as well. So if you go to the next slide, if we start at the high level of the evolution of the planning process and specifically distribution planning, you can go to the next one, sorry. So here you see, we have communicated over the years that the planning process really is in transition. On the left-hand side, is our traditional distribution planning process. So you'll see we have a couple inputs. Typically it's been, distribution assessment, whether that's aging infrastructure, reliability, also load forecasts, as well as even DER forecasts. But really a lot of those forecasts were more at a linear level, but we would use those inputs to come up with, the planning process, ultimately recommendations that turn into a distribution investment. Now, really where we're going to focus today's session is on this right-hand side, the integrated distribution planning side of things, and get into more detail on the areas that are highlighted or circled in that red, because those are the areas that are really evolving and changing, specifically with the goal of trying to integrate more DER and hosting capacity into the planning process. So if you go to the next slide, that makes the right-hand side bigger here. So again, the highlighted areas in red are the areas that we're going to focus on today, because these are the areas that really are evolving and changing. But two key items I guess I wanted to also bring up is first, distribution planning and the goal of distribution planning, I think everyone understands, is to still always maintain the reliability, stability of the system. The second piece is this is not interconnection specific. The focus really is planning. Obviously that has an interconnection component to it or DER component to it. But when we talk about planning, we're really talking more about a system-wide holistic approach to system needs, whereas interconnections is really more typically specific to one individual DER site. So planning is more holistic of a broader view than an interconnection, but obviously those are all components of distribution engineering analysis, as you can see we have in this diagram. And then getting into really the key areas that we're going to focus on today that's evolving and changing this process. The first being the multi-scenario forecasting in the top left up there. So what we're seeing various different resources, both load and generation. Obviously that changes, potential outcome for the future. So, doing more multi-scenario forecasting as opposed to just a typical linear forecast is definitely something that needs to evolve and change. The annual long-term distribution planning process itself within that blue bubble there, we would still likely look to do that on an annual basis, but we need to look at more just different aspects within that process, whether it's additional load periods, typically it's always just been a load, one load peak time frame. We need to look at additional components to that, as well as from a ratings perspective, kind of a headroom analysis. We are typically looking at just load, but now does there need to be some consideration for generation headroom? To the right-hand side, we have also highlighted the understanding locational value. So this one's actually kind of an input and an output. It's kind of a circular effect because, you have to look at, where do you have potentially multi-value projects? So projects that, have a reliability benefit, infrastructure benefit, also hosting capacity benefit. But then also where is there maybe a DER that can provide a solution and actually be a benefit specifically or NWA to the system. So that's kind of an input and an output. And then lastly, all of this essentially, feeds into the distribution planning process, and come up with recommendations and potential solutions that would lead to the distribution investment roadmap at the end. And part of that does obviously require conversations on prioritization as well. So if you go to the next slide. So just quickly going over, because we did receive a question of how the distribution planning process feeds into, the overall CGPP process, which is really more been of a focus on the transmission side of things. And if you look here, you can see that what's been proposed thus far as part of that CGPP is basically a 2-year planning stage made up of 6 components. How distribution feeds into this, we see this distribution occurring basically in a parallel process to how the transmission planning occurs, but making sure there's definite alignment and integration and touch points with the transmission side of things as well. So the first point of that is stage 1, alignment of load forecasts and scenarios. So making sure we're using, common forecasts and scenarios, whether it's for transmission or for distribution. Stage 2 is DER forecasts and distribution across the system. How much is assumed to be in the distribution system? So making sure, when we're looking at forecasts, again, if there's going to be items within the distribution system, that's feeding up into the transmission and vice versa. And then in identification of solutions and assessing possible influence to transmission solutions, again, ensuring that, if there's distribution projects that help meet CLCPA goals, that's being tied to, how maybe that impacts the transmission system, making sure there's alignment and they're being informed. And then lastly is inclusion in the lease cost planning review. So we won't be just looking at the transmission, but again, looking at distribution projects and how they might help and, overall costs. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, I mean, really, it's just making sure that these processes, distribution and transmission, are aligned and there's both sides are informed on what's going on each side for transmission and distribution. So with that, I am going to now turn it over to Jared from Pedo, who's going to go into more detail on forecasting.
Do we want to offer any, after each section, questions, Q&A, or do we want to wait to the end?
I guess so, because each of the next presenters are going to go over those areas that are in red in more detail. So, I mean, unless there's anything specific high level that anyone wants to ask, they can now. But if it's going to get more into like the details and questions on those areas specifically, maybe wait until after each of those presenters go, just because they hopefully might answer some questions maybe.
Okay. So are there any questions on it from a high level for Stephanie, what Stephanie went over?
Jason, it's Kat from New Leaf. I do have one, and I'm sorry I missed roll call. So Stephanie, just going back to the previous slide, am I assuming from this slide that the distribution planning process is kind of running in parallel with the transmission piece and it's part of the CGPP, or is it a standalone process that's feeding into the CGPP? Can you clarify that for me?
Yeah, so it would, definitely parallel, and it's really not too much different than what we do today. Transmission looks at the needs for their side, distribution does, so it would be a parallel process, but definitely making sure that there's, collaboration with the transmission to understanding what's going on, what they're seeing on their side, what distribution's seeing on their side, and then that will eventually, though, feed into a portion of the CGPP. So I think we did anticipate there being a distribution piece within the CGPP, but again, it'd be a parallel process for transmission, if that hopefully makes sense.
Okay, and would it be occurring on at the same time frame? Meaning the CGPP is envisioning a 2-year process, would the distribution planning component also be a 2-year process?
Yeah, so it's interesting you bring that up because I know that also gets to some of even with the distribution system implementation plan, our DSIPs, there's some conversation about where those go. But yes, essentially at the end of the day, yes, it will definitely feed into this process, even though it's 2-year. I think even there's been some conversations on maybe even moving this out, but I know that this is still being fleshed out within those other stakeholder meetings. But yeah, essentially there'll be alignment even though it's 2-year. I mean, we'll still do, our analysis, but we want to make sure any sort of forecasts that are done have alignment to what's being proposed within the CGPP.
Okay, and then final question, and I'm sorry if I missed this. How long does the distribution planning process take currently without the changes included for the CLCPA?
So currently what we're doing for distribution, is that what your question is?
That's right. How long is the cycle and how frequently is the cycle?
So right now we're really looking at it on an annual basis, but as I mentioned previously, it's really more on a load and some DER component to it for like forecasting analysis. But with the complexities that are needed for looking at, obviously generation headroom and some of the other items that we're going to go over in more detail. I mean, I don't know that we would still always look at our system on an annual basis, but I think to kind of understand, what projects can be developed or determined to meet CLCPA goals. I guess I don't have a specific answer on, will that annual change or not? I think we'll always look at our system on an annual basis, but for the purposes of the CGPP, maybe that might look like a different timing structure, because I think that's what your questions have kind of ultimately getting at.
That's right. That's kind of framing for like what comes next. So that's why I wanted to ask that. Thank you so much.
Yep, no problem.
Guys, I have one real quick, and I'm not actually asking for a response on this. This is Greg with Empower Solar. It's just a footnote, a question of whether or not PSEG Long Island follows the same process as what's being presented here. Obviously, they're not formally a member of the JU. I'm not necessarily expecting an answer now, just highlighting that this is a question that I'm not sure about. So.
Good morning, Greg. This is Annie. I can respond to that. For the CGPP process, I was just outlined a slide before what Stephanie went over it. You know, we are part of that process and development and working with the GUs.
Okay, thanks, Annie. Yeah, it's interesting to contrast the cycle here with what you guys do. So thank you for that. We'll follow up again.
Okay, it sounds like I think we can move on.
Okay, great. So, hello everybody. I'm Jared Trampeno. I'm manager in our distribution planning department here at Con Edison. I'm going to talk a little bit about multi-scenario forecasting. I think as we get into the first slide here, I think the thing that I'll say first is the core input to the distribution planning process for the utilities is obviously the forecast component. Kind of piggybacking on the question that was asked earlier, you know, we do an annual review, obviously, of the system based on the observed, you know, previous year's peak, you know, to make sure that on an annualized basis, we're doing the necessary upgrades to continue to meet that, obviously, peak load window year in and year out. We do, you know, future forecasting out into the later years for the larger infrastructure projects, things at the substation level that obviously require longer lead times from a planning process than, you know, some of those smaller system upgrades that happen on an annual basis. But everything kind of stems from the forecast. And I think what these slides are going to speak to is, obviously, we realize that New York has the goal to provide 100% renewable energy by 2040. That's a fairly deterministic goal. That's a goal that obviously extends out, you know, 20 years from today. And we realize that there's probably multi-scenarios that can, you know, go into a forecast like that. So we're already modifying some of our near-term planning. We're kind of modifying that planning horizon to 10 years. Again, to provide adequate lead time for infrastructure investments. Stephanie touched on some of this at a high level in the beginning. Again, we've always done load forecasting to do, obviously, system level relief. But how do we adequately forecast in and plan for more renewable energy goals on longer timelines that align more with some of the CLCPA benchmarks and maybe do not align in the same method that annual kind of system forecasting and upgrade planning was traditionally done. And then something we've heard on a number of these stakeholder engagements, whether it's been through this process or whether it's been through processes that we've run through the DSIP or through hosting capacity, you know, we also realize that there's obviously a multitude of different scenarios of how DER penetration across technology sectors is obviously going to show up in our forecast, and how that's aligned with the CLCPA goals and how that becomes an input to the planning process. So we understand that we're going to have to determine how multi-scenarios for DER adoption at the distribution level are going to show up both in the near term and in the long term as we look, you know, closer towards the goals in the outer years. And if a top-down approach is used, you know, we realize that there's going to be some definition around a process to kind of disaggregate larger system numbers or larger goals of how much from various technologies are going to be, you know, showing up throughout the various components of our system to kind of disaggregate that number from a transmission level number to a sub-transmission number to a distribution substation number. And then ultimately, you know, and speaking for Con Edison, that would be like how we would forecast how those various technologies or how the various DERs at the distribution system could show up throughout our networks on a more refined basis. And so what does this look like? If we get into slide 8 here, the next slide, it would look mostly like a top-down forecast that would be applied across the different types of technologies, across obviously a longer forecast window that was looking into the future to, you know, to achieve those goals later on in the years that the CLCPA outlines. So after a scenario would be decided, that scenario would kind of be disaggregated across the utility by technology and by year. So what you're looking at here is obviously it would be the dotted line would sort of indicate, you know, the load window or load growth that the utility would be forecasting over time. The bold line with the various bullet points across this time horizon here would kind of show what the DER adoption would do to obviously modify that load growth into the future. And then the various kind of bar charts that you're looking at across the years on the bottom would be how we would disaggregate how that overall DER impact would show up technology by technology and what impact those various technologies would have specifically on the areas of the system that we are kind of forecasting those penetration levels. So I think that, you know, these two slides overall kind of meant to piggyback a little bit on what Stephanie had mentioned earlier in terms of what some of the overall tweaks are going to be to traditional utility distribution planning. This kind of serves as the primary input. So this is essentially the first area that we would look to tweak because it sets up the majority of the areas that are going to be spoken to here later in the presentation. Specifically, after me, I'll be turning it over to Tom Brown, who's going to go over kind of some more refined elements of that distribution planning process. But we realize that this is a core input, and because it's a core input, it's obviously something that needs to be refined to make sure that we're adequately kind of adapting DER drivers into the way that we're forecasting, you know, system load growth and system dynamics, you know, throughout the full windows that that will take us up eventually to achieving the goals in the later years. And I'm sure there's probably questions here, so I'll pause for questions before we turn it over to Tom Brown. I see one. Is that you, Bill?
Yep. Bill Acker here, New York Best. Thanks, Jared. I've got a few questions. With regard to the way this top down, it looks like it to some extent couples the DER forecasts with the load forecasts, and I just like to understand that and get your thoughts on this. So if you have a few different load forecasts that you're considering, and a few different DER scenarios that you're considering, is the way does this approach automatically link those? So you know, if you had a very simplistically a high, medium, low and a high, medium, low on load and DER, that they kind of always couple, and you wouldn't have 9 cases, you'd only have 6 cases.
Yeah, I think that's right, Bill. I think, you know, that's kind of open for additional refinement here as we, you know, refine the way that we would look at that. I know Con Edison looks at it that way. You know, currently for our 10 and 20-year load relief plans, we do include DER modifiers into that forecast. Things like our, you know, organic or programmatic EE. You know, obviously things like solar adoption, EV adoption, you know, battery storage adoption. I think, you know, kind of the core component that we would look to begin this exercise with is better understanding the ways that we're forecasting the adoption of those DERs across those years. And I think to your point, the high, medium, and low makes sense. I think the way that we've talked about it as a JU has been understanding that there's going to be a pretty specific value or number on those different technologies, because we know the goal that we're shooting for. Obviously, they can show up at different rates, they can show up at different times, but sort of understanding the overall portfolio, perhaps, I'll put it, in terms of the goals, and then maybe refining to the high, medium, and low, and kind of regressing to higher levels of confidence in the earlier years where we know we're actually staging projects to be sure on a year in and year out basis, you know, as we stage that work, that we are operating around higher confidence forecasts in the near term while we continue to refine sort of the forecast that we would have in the later years as we really start to achieve those goals. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying, and I think, I guess my one thing that I would ask you guys to think a little bit about is, by kind of bundling this together in the top down, you automatically are limiting a lot of the cases, and I realize there are way too many possible cases to consider, so I understand why you're doing that. But you probably want to give some thought to whether there are scenarios that get avoided in this approach, of a very high heat pump adoption, like building electrification adoption, and a low another adoption that wouldn't show up in your scenario planning because of the way this is all bundled together. So you just may want to think through some of those different permutations as you're thinking about this. I guess the other question I have for you, Jared, and this is more for my education. Can you talk a little bit about kind of how you think about this geographically? I mean, this is a top-down scenario, but as you start to think about the geographic effects.
Yeah, absolutely. The top down, I would just consider that to be a starting number, and then obviously, again, the way that we're looking at it internally, at our company, and obviously open for some of the other JU to jump in as well. We realize that we're going to continue to have higher levels of let's say PV adoption in our service territory in areas like Westchester County and Staten Island, right? We would take that into account and do some trending in terms of where we have seen that adoption, where we would consider to continue to see some of that adoption. I think we're going to get into some slides towards the end of this presentation that talks a little bit about how the utility might look at identifying areas or communicating better to the market where some of those technologies might be better compensated or better suited to locate in the outer years to help drive some more certainty around how those technologies start to show up. But we at Con Ed, obviously, we do a network by network forecast, as I know you're familiar with. And the dynamics of those networks are taken into account as we do the planning, obviously understanding that areas where there might be more land availability or space will obviously gear themselves to be more likely toward adoption of larger solar installations, areas that we might see battery storage develop, or areas where we might be looking to obviously guide some development of energy storage. I'm sure you saw the RFP that came out for storage specific non-wire solutions type projects in our networks. We would definitely be looking to refine geographically in our system territory. And again, in those upfront years where we're looking for a little bit more specificity in terms of what we're planning for, that would be a core component, is understanding we're obviously seeing trends in certain areas. We expect some of those trends to continue, and we would be planning that forecast or working that forecast into those areas that we have confidence around seeing a higher proliferation of perhaps one technology over another technology. And we would refine that kind of as we move forward, right? That's something that we're already starting to look at by kind of looking at some trends and statistics on our Power Ready program, where a lot of the applications are showing up for DCFC chargers and L2 chargers. We would definitely be looking to locationally refine that, because that is obviously how, at least at Con Ed, we do network by network planning. So the network by network forecast would be a core input into what we were looking to do.
Bill, this is Tom Vaccaro with Grid, and I just wanted to add a little bit to what was said there. Jared, thank you for the kickoff there. But a couple of things that you touch on actually are great questions that we think about all the time, and we're in the middle of a sort of forecasting transition at most of the utilities here at slightly different stages, but that hits right at the heart of your question. So really where you're going, addressing both of your questions, the first one about, hey, you have all these different scenarios and how are you using them, really talking about how do you use them deterministically, which is the way we've planned for 100 years here in New York and in most utilities. And how do you pick the right scenarios, and how do you avoid having, I think at National Grid, when I looked through all the different scenarios for all the different subcomponents, it was something like 200 or 300 different scenario forecast outputs when you concatenate all the different possibilities and permutations, to your point, which is unmanageable. So part of this is not just about, as we learn how to select some of the more relevant combinations, right? The ones that are maybe more conservative, that allow us to have some confidence, but some that are also middle of the road. We also have to take steps towards probabilistic planning, where we're assigning different probabilities to these and trying to build infrastructure and provide solutions for the needs that are the most statistically relevant. So that's a transition that we're definitely in the middle of and not nearly completed. But we're on the path towards it. I think it hits at the point you're saying where, if we try to do deterministic with hundreds of scenarios, we're going to have some blind spots, and we can't, the probabilistic approach hopefully will help us get from A to Z in a little bit more of an efficient way. That's one part. And the second part you noted is very salient because something that we have to do in forecasting that we've never had to do before is try and put ourselves in the shoes of different customers and stakeholders who have to make decisions, right? Like yourself, am I going to build this battery here or not? Like a solar developer, am I going to build this solar installation or not? Like an EV charging customer, am I going to build this charger here or not? And historically, we've had the benefit of historic numbers to train our models, so we didn't have to pontificate as to who wants to do what and when. But nowadays, we are changing that. I can say, for example, at National Grid, our solar forecast sort of does its best job of putting its DG interconnector hat on. It looks at the value stack revenues, it looks at available hosting capacity, and it actually does also look for available land and tries to disaggregate that top-down number using that sort of bottom-up approach. But it's highly imperfect, and one of the things I think Jared touched on that is important to talk about here is the futility in doing that, because without any certainty, right, 90% of the queue dropping out any given year due to the flexibility that's built into that system, it makes it very, very hard and in some cases futile to try and confidently predict where certain, particularly policy-driven DERs are going to appear. I think that's one of the topics we're going to talk about today is how we can, what mechanisms we can use to help us build mutual confidence in where things are going to show up so that we can answer Jason and Liz's question more accurately. How can we give staff and the commission confidence that where the utilities say hosting capacity upgrades go are actually warranted and needed? And with the forecasting we have today and the flexibility built into the system, it becomes very difficult to do that. So I think those are very salient questions and things that we're definitely going to touch on in the planning process as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Doug, and thanks, Jared. Those are great answers. I appreciate it.
Jared, this is Andy at DPS. I had a couple quick questions. Is this graph that you're showing right now, is this based on real analysis, real numbers derived from real analysis, or is this meant to be more illustrative?
Yeah, I would look at this as being more illustrative, Andy.
And so that sort of influences the second question, which was, when looking at this, there's something that appears a little odd to me, which is that from year to year, like PV varies quite a bit, and so there's a period in the middle of the graph where PV's quite significant, and then it drops off quite radically. What was that, around I'm not sure which year that is. It's a little bit of an eye test, but that one, yeah. Was there any particular actual reason for that, or was that just sort of artistic license?
I think I would consider that to be more artistic license, Andy. I think what we were just trying to illustrate here is the kind of the changing dynamics of how you can have a little bit more of one technology show up in any given year. You can have some more of another technology show up in any given year. I certainly I would tell Bill Acker here, who's looking at this graph now, I wouldn't expect, Bill, that we would wait that long to see energy storage show up on the top of this bar chart in those outer years. Don't worry about that. Yeah. So yeah, Andy, this was just kind of meant to see to kind of show how we would be doing kind of an annualized look at what those technologies, how those technologies might proliferate throughout our service territory, how those would kind of bake themselves into the overall load forecast, how the load forecast would be altered, but how we would have to have a much more refined viewpoint to what Tom Vaccaro was just talking about around on an annualized basis. What is the confidence factor in forecasting any one of these kind of sub drivers to the forecast, and kind of the need to increase levels of confidence specifically in the outer years around what are the amounts and what are the types of technologies that we can see kind of year to year, and what are the effects on the overall forecast?
Andy, one other thing to add. I think this might be National Grid. It looks like an old, I only say that because I know this format. I worked on our forecast, and it looks about like our peak around 7 gigawatts. I will take it back and confirm, but I think this might be National Grid, and if it is, one of the reasons we see that DER variability on top of what Jared said, he's right, is also a shifting peak time. So this is about on-peak contribution to the upstate, if it's ours, our upstate local peak. And sort of as you go out in years, the peak hour is shifting out from that like 3 to 5 p.m. typical MISO peak out later and later, which lowers the PV contribution. And I'm not sure, I don't think in this one there was a winter peaking consideration since this is a 2019, but that later peak also affects the PV contribution.
And I think that I believe this is the kind of the crux of what was being discussed a couple minutes ago, which is that the locational granularity of this kind of forecast information is a pretty significant decision to be made, and it would vary by utility, presumably, number one, and I think that granularity is important from a developer's point of view, because if the area of analysis starts to get too big, it starts to lose a lot of value as far as developers being able to anticipate or to understand where their opportunities are. So does that I guess the thing is that the output of the planning process would need to have some real locational granularity.
Yeah, no, that point is taken, and again, I appreciate Tom's clarification on the forecast here. I certainly wasn't meant to say that grid is not providing accurate numbers, but that this, again, because of kind of piggybacking off what Tom mentioned, right? This represents one forecast that Tom kind of spoke to earlier around one type of analysis that was done, basically DER contribution to a peak. And getting to your point, Andy, we understand that there are going to be different forecasts that are going to mean different things to different folks. That's why we kind of titled this multi-scenario. Obviously, for things like electric vehicles, the charge component to that will be much more, it'll be viewed as much more of a concern when we talk about planning to a peak load window. Whereas PV, as you know, as our hosting capacity calculations take into account, right? Much more concerned with what the hosting capacity would be based on future forecasts looking out for what the minimum load kind of forecasts would be in those coincident areas. So your point is well taken, and again, the reason I just say this is illustrative is because this is one component to one forecast that we would look at, and we realize that there's going to be locational granularity, there's going to be timing granularity, both in years and in hours during the day. That the point of this kind of is that we realize that we need to build greater levels of confidence into all of those forecasts that Tom Ficarra spoke to earlier, and really better understand technology by technology what the impact of those technologies are on any one of those forecasts.
Okay, thanks.
So it looks like Zach and Brandon have their hands up. I just want to make sure we don't run into a time issue down the road. So why don't we, Zach, if you want to go ahead, and if we can wrap up the questions on this stuff in the next couple minutes, that'd be great. And otherwise, we can kind of hold questions to the end, and hopefully we'll have additional time at the end if you guys don't mind.
Yeah, that sounds good, Jason. I can keep it quick. Some of my questions were just answered, and I appreciate the peak drop here. So, and I assume that EE is energy efficiency, EV is electric vehicles. I'm not sure what DR is. Sorry, I know I should know this.
The demand response.
Okay, and so the energy efficiency is something that takes away from load, and electric vehicles are something that add to load. And so I know I'm probably sounding stupid here, but I'm confused why they're kind of stacked if they perform.
It would be a positive or a negative load modifier, Zach. So to your point, right? 2 megawatts of EV would be a plus, let's say like a plus 2 megawatt load modifier, whereas 3 megawatts of energy efficiency would be a net negative 3 megawatts, right? So those bar charts are just kind of meant to indicate that we are taking a variety of different load modifiers into the equation, some positive, some negative. But the combination of all of those would be ultimately the effect of how that bold line adjusts to the load peak based on the combination of the variability of that stack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Cool. And then I guess just like with this top-down approach, the last slide mentioned 2040, which, the CLCPA goal is a zero emissions grid. And then this chart only goes to 2030. And I realize this is just an illustrative chart, but I just wanted to get a sense, when you say top-down, is it that 2040 goal? How much are you taking into account the tech-specific targets, some of which have been increased from the CLCPA?
I'm going to take a stab at. I think I see what you're asking, right? We would be working with deterministic numbers where numbers are deterministic, right? So we understand that there's obviously a 6 gigawatt energy storage goal or a 10 gigawatt PV goal. We understand that those numbers, with the years that they are to be achieved, right, from a statewide perspective, those would be deterministic numbers, right? Then the work would be to determine on a utility by utility basis sort of how much of that are we anticipating shows up in any one service territory, and then that's where you kind of get the utility by utility specific forecasts. So to the extent that there are goals out there, we would be forecasting to those goals. The variability of how we get to those numbers on an annualized basis would be some of the scenarios that we would be taking a look at. And again, that gets back to Andy and Bill's point about, locational granularity, technology, maybe specific adoptions, right? Just speaking for Con Edison, we understand that based on the way that we're incentivizing some of the EV chargers, like we sort of know right now what networks might see more EV adoption in the upfront years, things to that nature. So where there's broad goals that we are working towards, we obviously we view those as goals that will be achieved. How you get year in, year out variability, that's where we get into some of the multi-scenario components that we're talking to here.
Okay, that's helpful. I guess I would just encourage, not to let, those goals be so deterministic, right? Like we start modeling 6 gigawatts. I mean, you're plugging in 6 gigawatts and assuming 6 gigawatts by this year. But, the market has responded quicker than that. We're now bumping up to 10. It looks like we're going to get 10. So rather than putting 10 in there, doing a more holistic approach to this where in reality, we only have target specific goals up to 2030. And so I appreciate, at least plugging those in up to 2030, but still looking at large growth after 2030 that aren't part of those goals, right? So the DER and the LSR, that's like the tech specific goals is 70% and already changing from how they're set, right?
And we completely hear you on that, right? And our forecasting exercises that happen on an annualized basis, right? We're kind of just using that as a starting point for today, right? Because that's where we're confident in terms of those longer lead times where those goals are. But to the extent that trends show up on a year in and year out basis, where we understand that we're getting one of those technologies much quicker than a goal that was forecasted 20 years down the line, we would certainly adjust the trend and tweak the forecast of any one technology within that overall load forecast. That is something that we would do. Yeah.
Awesome. That's helpful. And definitely if we're talking top down, it's 2040, just to confirm that.
Yes. Consistent with the number that you referenced on the slide previous to this.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, can we move forward and turn it over to Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Brown. I'm Section Manager of Transmission and Distribution Planning at O&R, and I'm going to cover the section on annual long-term distribution planning and, quickly talk about the way things are done now and also to, talk about some of the potential changes in the future and things that the JU are discussing. And there's one additional slide on a question that was submitted to the JU regarding project selection, and I'll walk through that process. So the first slide here, beginning, if you look at the heading on top, talks about the existing planning process, like Stephanie mentioned, tying to peak load requirements. But we know in the future that the new planning processes that the JU are going to develop are going to need additional analysis of the off-peak and shoulder periods, to, kind of to Jared's point, to identify the constraints on the system that are going to deliver or lead to the projects that support the CLCPA goals that were discussed. And utilities are also making significant investments on the technology side with new automation, new systems like ADMS, AMI to increase data granularity. That'll help refine some of the assumptions that we were just talking about with the forecast, and also improve forecast accuracy. And to the point, like, well, where is that that DER going to develop at the circuit or a geographic level on the system. Moving on to the second bullet, working through the new CGPP process, we want to ensure that the distribution planning and the transmission planning are aligned from the substation level up through the sub-transmission and to the transmission level, to make sure that we're eliminating bottlenecks with future projects, and that projects are aligned to allow higher levels of DER interconnection. And the last bullet is really, among other items, to have a greater focus in the planning process, on headroom, on bottling renewables, and meeting the state's goals, but at the same time, having the proper systems and controls in place to ensure, that reliability and safety, along with, the interconnections remain in focus. So you can go to the next slide, Jason. Okay, moving on to headroom and unbottling renewables. So this slide is designed really to talk about future adapting T&D planning processes to meet the future reliability needs, which could even be greater in an electrified future, and also the hosting capacity needs to move towards the generation goals that were already discussed. So we still see, at least at O&R, probably across the JU, that that the annual system assessment and planning process is going to begin with a forecast that's done every year. But we're also going to begin in the new process, not just look at peak load, but what are those off-peak load periods, and what type of constraints can this new planning process identify that can lead to projects that support local generation. And also, like I previously mentioned, identify the projects that increase headroom and coordinate or align capacity needs, from down at least to the substation, potentially circuit level, through the sub-transmission up to the transmission level, more through that new CGPP process. But at the same time, we want to overlay, those needs with, our base reliability needs and, equipment obsolescence, and other qualitative aspects of projects to make sure, that when we prioritize projects, we provide the projects that, give the best value to the system, or provide the best value. And another thing that we're doing with, we've already started doing is, we're looking at transmission and distribution designs that, support the load needs of the future, which is, kind of traditional planning, but also designing for the future. If we know an area is more likely probabilistically to get more DER in a location, whether that's available land, etc. We want to look primarily in those areas, like, are we designing for the potential for DER in that area? Should we be designing, future substations with additional circuit positions that, will give more circuit hosting capacity? And also, at the transmission level, if you're upgrading an area, say sub-transmission to, say 34 kV to 69 kV, should you maintain it at 34 kV, or with the potential for, DER in an area, should you go to 69 kV or potentially a higher voltage level? And moving on to the second set of bullets, you continue to use, most utilities use to a certain extent, where is the DER? Where are you getting the adoption on your system? Plus, what does the DER queue look like when you're planning, substation and transmission upgrades, in addition to, things that were already mentioned when it comes to load, obsolescence, and reliability needs on the system. And there's more discussion on it, but incentivizing, there's already LSRV, but are there other ways to incentivize DER projects to provide better system locational value, potentially to defer other projects or improve, improve system performance? And the next bullet is, in most utilities are already doing this. When you prioritize or optimize a budget or a portfolio of projects, are you appropriately weighing the environmental benefits to the CLCPA goals associated with that project? So you make sure you're appropriately weighting that project so it winds up being prioritized in the right order, with the other projects in the portfolio. And we also, all the utilities are already doing it, but with the new systems and software that utilities use, use that data from the investment that we get from grid mod and other other systems that utilities are implementing. How do we use that data, or can we use that data to better refine our forecasts and identify potential bottlenecks? And finally, it's part of the CGPP, but we want to have alignment wherever possible across the JU, or where appropriate, to make sure our design standards, make sense, from a contingency perspective, level of headroom, can we align wherever possible to, facilitate interconnections? You can go to the next slide, Jason. Moving on to
Tom, just before you leave that slide, I just had an observation on the previous slide that I'm not seeing any mention, which I think would be important to mention, is that headroom and unbottling renewables. There's an opportunity for flexible load, including energy storage resources, to create that headroom. And I would think that would be, one of the key potential solutions from one part to the next.
Yeah, I mentioned that. Yeah, that's a good point, Andy. I mentioned that a little bit on the next slide, but you're referring to flexible interconnection, basically, and I was going to cover that more in the last bullet on this slide with DERMS.
I'm not quite sure I'm saying flexible interconnection. I'm more broadly talking about being able to have flexible load that can consume renewable energy when there's a need to do that from a system perspective.
Oh, flexible load. Okay.
Yeah, Andy, this is Jared at Con Ed. I think we might be speaking a little bit to that when we get into locational value in the slides coming up as well. So.
Okay, thank you.
And this is Zach with Missy, and I appreciate that, Andy. And we encourage to look at those in tandem and how flexible load and flexible generation, I guess flexible interconnection can create flexible generation, if you will, and how those can, those interplaying can work together. It sounds like you're going to cover that, but just wanted to make that connection. Like, I think they're a little bit tied together too.
Yeah, I agree. I think they are tied together. Okay, moving on to the section on energy engineering and administrative controls. So a big piece of the technology that utilities are investing in is to get more granular data, down to the circuit level, in some cases with AMI down to the customer level, bringing that data back to the new systems, using that data, incorporating into your system modeling, into your planning, into refining your forecast, refining assumptions of how different technologies are going to operate, is all critical, not just for the interconnection of DER or higher levels of integrating DER, but also, for the safe and reliable operation of the system. So the utilities are investing, most utilities or all utilities are making significant investments in grid mod, more devices, more smart grid on the system, implementing the systems that bring that data back, to a central operating system like an ADMS, where that data is filtered, collected. It's going to enable more visibility for operator control as well as planning purposes, and potentially enable systems like volt-var optimization, for a voltage optimization perspective, and also reliability component for systems like Flizzr, where we can remotely or automatically isolate faults and sectionalize the system and restore customers. So, and those systems are going to prepare the way for DERM systems, for where we can, more actively control or manage different types of DER on the system. I think with the flexible interconnections that were mentioned, also, being able to use batteries, to store excess generation in the future and dispatch it at the right times, where it makes sense, from a system perspective. But maybe I'll stop there if there's any additional questions on that.
This is Danny Wagner with AEE. I'm wondering, like, to what extent do you know if customers have maybe gotten an EV or 2 EVs, or maybe they've installed a battery pack without telling the utility, and it's in the garage and it's really acting as a load modifier. If you see significant changes in customer load, do you know why it's happening? Or for your load forecast, does it even matter, why it's happening? Is it, I mean, you'll see the overall aggregate impact, but can you determine why it's happening, and is it important for your forecast to know why it's happening?
Yeah, it's that, for O&R, and I'm sure for the other utilities, it's absolutely important for for understanding where different technologies being adopted. But we do have data, I believe, the registration data for EVs, when customers buy EVs, and that at least at O&R we incorporate that into the circuit level forecast. So we as previously discussed on the forecasting slide, which was more focused on what does your system level look like from a top down, what's the contribution from each load modifier. We also do a bottom up approach where we allocate, based on different assumptions, what technology is more likely to be adopted in a different area of the system. So we take that circuit level forecast, aggregate it up to the bank level forecast, and we make sure that we marry our top down and bottom up approaches together to make sure that these same assumptions are being made, all the way down to the circuit level. So we do have data on EVs
But
for customers.
I guess just to clarify, I imagine it happens sometimes that customers may do something and not tell you. Are you able to look at the data, or do you have some sort of algorithm that you use to look at the data and see if there are big changes that to a customer consumption that may be impactful for system planning, but that customers haven't told you that, hey, I bought an EV, or I've done this or that?
Yeah, I think with AMI that might be possible, but right now, at least at O&R, we're really looking more at the at the circuit level at least, but not necessarily looking at specific customer behavioral changes. I mean, unless they upgrade their service and something makes its way through the new business process, where, say, to support the 2 EV chargers they're putting in, they have to upgrade the service on their house, and that makes it through our new business, and then it can get captured by the the planners doing the forecast.
A quick note, Tom from Grid. It's a good, absolutely right. We from planning, those types of considerations aren't particularly salient, right? Planners need to understand how much load is moving through, particularly at peak, and make sure that the system is capable of delivering it, and it doesn't care if the electron's going to a battery or a car or a blender. But what you said is very relevant when it comes to forecasting. And so AMI and other devices like that, I know we've had experiments with like sense devices and other things like that where we can see a little bit more behind the meter, use advanced technology to maybe take guesses at what's behind the meter based on motor signatures and things like that. And that becomes more important for us when it comes to forecasting, right? If we understand that this customer's 10 kW is 5 kW of car and 5 kW of smart home, that helps us understand for years in the future how that customer is going to operate and maybe change their load. So from that impact, from that standpoint, it definitely affects planning. But in terms of a planner doing a study on a feeder, are they particularly concerned that this customer's load is this subcomponent or that subcomponent? The way we plan today, it doesn't have a huge impact. But for forecasting, it's a very relevant concern, and AMI is one of the tools, to Tom's point, that we're hoping to use to help disaggregate some of those behind-the-meter insights.
Thanks.
This is Andy at DPS again. One of the things that has occurred to me from time to time on this whole matter is that the different scenarios, looking into the future and anticipating different kinds of scenarios and making judgments from that, there's an operating component that is, I think, going to be more and more important as there's greater DER penetration. And that, so an operating capability and an operating strategy can have a real effect on how much load is happening where, how much supply is happening where. And I don't know whether this is something that's kind of baked into the way that you think about this stuff, or is it something that we have to kind of come up with as things evolve.
Yeah, I guess Andy, it's there's definitely an operational component to even to the slide we're looking at. There's a great value in the systems to planning where you get the data, and to Tom Vaccaro's point, where does that fit into the planning process? So obviously customer behavior is going to influence the assumptions that you use for when you how you build your forecast and how you allocate different load modifiers to areas of the system. Because but there's an operational piece with we can engineer the system from a planning perspective, but then it has to go down to the room where the operators are going to sit, and we got to make sure that they have the visibility, the monitoring and control that they need to make sure that the system's operated safely, but also to take advantage of the opportunities created by the DER on the system between battery, PV, et cetera. So that's key to I believe the investments that the utilities are making.
Yeah, so I would just I think somewhere along the way, as this either right from the start or as things evolve over time, that kind of consideration within the planning, it needs to be there, and it should be, there should be some transparency around it, and it should be possible for people to understand what the assumptions are and what the strategies are.
Yeah, good point. Okay, this last slide that I'm covering is more that a question that came into the JU. So the question was, what is the utility process in identifying least cost solutions, and how does DSIP related work, for example, feed into this process? So thought the best way to answer, the question was just, quickly go through, how the utilities perform the annual assessment. So, the first bullet is, utilities develop the forecast each year. The forecast is used, to go through an assessment of the system. So it usually covers at least a 2, 5, or 10-year period. There's also long-term planning or long-range planning, which could cover, 20-year period to make sure, are you planning the system to support the needs, the reliability, load needs, and other CLCPA needs in the future. So once the forecast is developed during that annual process, then you do your, contingency analysis is what we call it at O&R, where you look at your design standards and you compare your forecasted values, for all the assets on your systems, transformers, circuits, et cetera, for each year of the forecast period. You look at your normal loading. You also look at contingency, conditions, loss of circuit, loss of bank, and other operating risks. And then when you do identify deficiencies, usually a number of traditional solutions are developed, usually from a least cost perspective first to resolve the system need. There's, sometimes you might just need to reconfigure a circuit just to, eliminate a criteria violation. But when it gets to the point where, a project is needed, usually several projects are recommended because there's always, more than one way to solve a problem. Each one is evaluated. You look at the qualitative aspects, of a project. Like, one example could be, does it help you meet CLCPA goals? Does it tie to other projects that you're doing in an area? Does it address equipment obsolescence or, quantitative aspects like, anything you can quantify, like the reliability benefit or other benefits specific to a project, and as well as the cost effectiveness. So, once you get through that portfolio of projects, you analyze them based on those traits. You go to a preferred traditional project. You also look at the timing. When is the timing of that project? When is it needed by to resolve, the system contingency, and what year is that going to develop on the system, based on the analysis. And then we go through a process of looking, are there non-wires opportunities to defer, reprioritize the projects in the portfolio, or can we even eliminate a project with a non-wires alternative? And we're also looking at solutions that combine maybe a lower cost traditional solution, with a non-wires approach to eliminate that more capital intensive project. But if a non-wires doesn't solve the system need and you do go forward with the traditional solution, another thing that we're looking at is also, what are the hosting capacity needs in that area? How does it align with other projects, at the sub-T or transmission level? And how can we get more value out of that traditional project? So, yeah, I don't know if the person that submitted the question is on the call, or if there's any other questions on this.
Yeah, I had a question. This is Eric Sweetman with Smarter Grid Solutions. My question was from the previous slide, just about the DERMS. So when you talk about the DERMS, I guess it's the integration of the DERMS. Is it the overall thinking that like it's a system wide, or is it the thinking of a possible like scalable solution?
Yeah, I think at least at O&R, I think, our vision of DERMS is more of a system-wide vision, where there would be a separate, different from the way we operate today. There would be a separate desk, so to speak, in our control center that would be managed by, a dedicated, at least person per shift, to manage the DERMS system and to track DR performance, et cetera, and dispatch and to be able to control that.
Okay. I got more, but I could take them offline because there's a lot to unpack on that.
Okay.
This is Zach with NICE. I guess, sorry, go ahead, Bill.
No, Zach, you go ahead. I'll go after you.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on that, and also just speak to the chatter in the chat. I think aligning with the, CLCPA goals is what we're all going towards. And that's why, we're talking about starting with 100% 2040. That looks much different than a 70% renewable grid. It would be a mistake not to start planning for that now and incorporating the cost saving elements, avoided transmission of DERs. I think that's, we're all on the same page with that. And I thought we were all on the same page with flexible interconnection as a cost reduction mechanism towards meeting that. And so it might be worth, if John could speak to that or someone else, why curtailment is against the goals of the CLCPA, when in our eyes, curtailment should absolutely, it's gonna happen. We need to plan for it, right? And do it in the most cost-effective way and build it into this planning, right? I mean, that.
Yes, I'll talk real briefly about it. There is a natural tension between curtailment of renewables and the investments to unbottle renewables. And that needs to be built into the process. So flexible generation and DERMS has to be balanced against a transmission or distribution investment meant to unbottle. And when the appropriate time to actually unbottle those resources reveals itself, such as through the economics or the idea that we've built now a number of resources that are being significantly curtailed, then we need to move from that approach of flexible interconnect and DERMS to a more traditional approach of investing to unbottle. So it's not the be all end all. Flexible generation is part of the solution, and a DERMS system would be part of the solution, but that natural tension needs to be built into the process.
No, I appreciate that. I think that's well said, right? And we certainly look at flexible interconnection as not only a kind of cost-saving way to continue progress, but like you said, it can act as a market indicator. Yeah, I mean, you know that. I want to repeat it. Appreciate that. But so I guess just to say, like, it should be talked about sooner rather than later, right? In this discussion, we're talking about it as a bridge towards, right, the investments. So I just encourage, Jason and folks at DPS to revisit this flexible interconnection discussion sooner rather than later, as we're all talking about it being a cost-saving mechanism towards, not later on in this process.
I'll just jump in one more time to say that a DERM solution and even flexible interconnect does require significant investments, even to stand those up. You heard Orange and Rockland's approach of system-wide. In order to get there, you have to have an ADMS. You have to have the ability to really look into your system during the real-time operations. You really need to stand up a lot to get.
And all the more reason to get rocking on that, right? Like if we're talking about it's going to take a while, if we don't get going now, then we're going to miss on that opportunity.
So Zach, I'm going to just kind of cut you off if you don't mind. I do want to kind of get through the slides since the JU put them together. I want to kind of get there. So unfortunately, from the Q&A side of things, I'd like to kind of limit the Q&A at this point, and then we can reassess once we get through the slides, just given the time frame and what we have left on our agenda. And we can drive the agenda once we get towards the end if we want to limit something else, but I would tend to try to move through the slides and limit Q&A at this point, given the time frame and what we have left, if everyone doesn't mind.
I'll put my question in the chat, Jason. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Jared then to cover the locational value.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I'll go through this. It's only one slide. I'll go through this relatively quickly. I think everybody's been hinting on that, to this point on the call so far, right? We understand that from a locational net benefit standpoint, getting into the conversation of looking at things geographically, looking at things from a system dynamics perspective, the utilities understand that there are going to be technologies that might have varying levels of value to varying portions of our system. right? And so I think what this really speaks to is the fact that we are considering and discussing kind of how we define a process for identifying what the beneficial locations of these technologies would be. And then also more explicitly incorporating hosting capacity into multi-value project planning. And I'll take those two things briefly kind of separately. I think Bill Acker might have brought it up on the call earlier. I know some folks have been hinting at it, right? The idea, and using the example that I spoke to for Con Edison earlier, understanding that as penetration levels from PV increase in areas like our Staten Island or Westchester overhead operating areas, understanding that there would be a significant value for batteries to co-locate in those areas sooner rather than later, and be able to charge during the minimum load windows and potentially discharge, obviously, into our peak windows. Understanding how to incentivize or combine or at least indicate where different technologies might have either an easier interconnection path or provide more benefit in the upfront years in certain areas is an exercise that we realize that we need to undertake. We need to give visibility into those benefits to you folks, the developers that are on the call, so that you can see a little bit more transparency into our system around where your project might have obviously a easier interconnection process and then more benefit moving forward, whether that's to the system, whether that's to the goals, whether that's monetarily speaking, discussions around how the utility plays a part in co-locating these projects so that the projects not only help the system, but can potentially help each other. And then a discussion around, once that process is in place, and even now when we're talking about doing distribution system planning to achieve future goals, how we are adequately looking at valuing the increase of hosting capacity into projects that we already have planned, right? That could be something as simple as, deciding to oversize transformers in the earlier years, understanding areas that might have proliferation of generation moving forward. To John Borchert's point that he's made in the chat and earlier, the unbottling discussion around, are we adequately taking hosting capacity concerns into the process and understanding where projects that might already be planned could benefit from tweaks that make them more multi-value, right? In a similar way that we talked about this during the TPWG process, the multi-value approach to making sure that resources are being unbottled, and adequately looking at each project and seeing whether or not that project could have an effect on hosting capacity and unbottling of resources moving forward as we plan to those goals in the outer years. So finding value and understanding value, whether it's indicating where value might be found in the territory or whether it's making sure that we are valuing the correct goal-oriented components, i.e. hosting capacity, moving forward into our distribution planning, as a couple of us have spoken to, obviously are areas of planning that need to be refined and will be incorporated, moving forward to make sure that the planning process is adequately taking into account all levels of the system, from point of interconnection, all the way back to obviously our sub-transmission and transmission substations from a distribution planning perspective. I guess I'll take some quick questions here. I think the only thing I would say is that some of the more distribution-oriented questions and answers that came from the last tech conference will be presented by Tom Vaccaro here on the slides coming forward. So from a timing perspective, maybe move to those.
Yeah, why don't we continue to move forward through the slides, and then we can hit Q&A again after we get through the slides.
Excellent. I will do my best job to speed talk here. Apologies, and I'll keep up with the chat to try and keep up, but if we could jump forward a slide or two. Perfect. I'll be brief here because I think this was covered in one of the questions we responded to earlier, but this is to talk about our investment roadmap, really about the capital planning part of system planning. As all of you know, we have forward-looking rate cases where we try to predict exactly what projects will be needed where and how much they're going to cost. And of course, we're not 100% accurate, and we need flexibility to reprioritize in real time as needs change and scope change, and particularly lately, material and labor costs change. So all the utilities are in slightly different positions, but prioritizing this plan is a very big part of what all of us do. It includes not just the capital piece, but consideration of operations. And lately, I anecdotally will speak to what we do at National Grid as generally representative of the trends we're making at the joint utilities, but we are moving forward to include significantly more considerations in our capital planning process, really prioritizing around societal value, because that's a sort of language we can all speak. So, for example, at National Grid, we've procured a tool and are moving forward with something that allows us to create value models for each of the subcomponents of a project's value, including its ability to provide system capacity, reliability, resiliency, but we are including new value adds every day, and you can see a couple of them listed on the page here. So specifically, hosting capacity, I could say, is one that we're working on integrating right now. We look at an upgrade's ability to, as a secondary benefit, provide hosting capacity to an area. And even if that isn't part of the project's driver, if it's something that it does, and our generation forecasts show that it might be utilized at some point in the future, that will be an added value to that project that'll move it a little further up the prioritization list and give it a better chance at sticking in the plan if we face turmoil, for example, now where material and labor costs are increasing and we have to make tough decisions given our regulated capital plans. So hosting capacity is one we're just starting to get into, but moving beyond that, we're looking at, like was talked about earlier, beneficial locations. If there are areas where, regardless of what the forecast says, we know it's just a great area to act as a sink for solar generation, and it's going to be just a low-cost way for society to take an incremental step towards the clean energy goals, we want to factor that in. And some of that is going on with the next bullet you see here, multi-value distribution, where utility-driven upgrades can be identified in a certain area, and we can say, hey, we understand you have your market-driven projects, but the utility thinks this is a great substation for our customers, for you to supply solar to make sure we are hitting our clean energy goals. So not to get into a ton of detail, that's something we're just starting, and like I said, every utility is in a slightly different place, but these are things we're starting to consider. We're starting to think more along societal value lines when optimizing our plans, and part of that societal value absolutely is hitting our clean energy goals and minimizing costs for DG interconnectors. I think we'll probably get going to the next stuff in the interest of time. I know this is where we're going to have some good discussion. So we have the 3 questions listed here. I'll just quickly read them and then we can jump through some of the back and forth we have. First question is, what modifications to the existing distribution planning processes are needed to ensure the Commission and the utilities are investing and spending money in the right areas to meet our goals? So I touched on this earlier around forecasting, and we'll talk more about how that's important and predictability is important. Discuss and explain how the utilities plan to integrate DER into their planning processes, and we will talk about a number of steps we have taken, and a number of steps we plan on taking and have to take. And then last, the need for additional and increased hosting capacity across the distribution system, more of a forward-looking question, so we'll address it forward-looking. So let's jump to the next slide. Excellent, and I'm just going to pull this up on my screen because this is the eye test. Apologies, folks. Okay. So what modifications to the existing distribution planning process are needed? We wanted to start with some steps already taken, and this one is particularly a place we've been working very hard since the REV initiatives started kicking off to change the way we do distribution planning to account for DER in New York. So we've modified some of our design parameters, obviously the SIR process over the last 5 years to identify what types of upgrades are needed, what isn't, and have those discussions with you in the community to find where things are necessary for reliability and where maybe we can afford to change our standards, right? PCC reclosers being one of the changes we've made over the years. Allowing higher DER penetration, right? Backfeeding something a planner of 5 years ago would never have thought was ever going to be a reality, and now something that we're looking at it in our forecasts, a large percentage of our stations potentially doing, especially if we're going to be assuming the clean energy goals are hit, which we are. And I won't continue to bleed this list dry just because I want to make sure we have time for your questions, but getting all the way towards the bottom, consideration of CLCPA orders, integrating CGPP, and most recently moving forward with Cost Sharing 2.0, a continuation on our journey to finding a most efficient way to cost allocate and meet our clean energy goals. I do want to talk about some of the future steps that are really important. So one, I think we put a couple of bullets on here. I'm going to generalize a little bit because I think some of these are pretty specific. But first and foremost is we're going to have 6 gigawatts of energy storage. We're very excited for it. We need to unlock it. We need to do everything we can to try and utilize every amazing capability that storage has, ramping up and ramping down, to value stack those systems and really allow them to do what they do best, which is enable the clean energy transition for society in an efficient manner. This is going to really require a lot of changes, not just at the interconnection stage, which we talked a little bit about throughout here, whether it's having a slightly more dynamic planning mindset where it's less about an annual system peak or annual minimum, and there's some dynamic nature that's creeping into our interconnection studies for the sake of efficiency, whether it's changing our planning practices to be able to utilize batteries that are either owned or not owned by us and operated or not operated by us in all different scenarios, whether through a non-wires alternative or a storage order procurement or you name it, ways that we can utilize these systems to meet both market needs and system planning needs. So really 2 fronts, the batteries need to be changed there. And you'll see a couple that mention batteries, and then continue to evaluate our design standards, modify them to encourage the clean energy future. And last mentioned here, what we're talking about today, the coordinated grid planning process, integrating with the transmission planning side of the house to make sure we're holistically considering all the benefits and costs DER provide to the grid and fairly allocating them. Question 1, more about a lot that we have done, a lot of change over the last 5 years, and still a lot of room to go. I'll go to the next one. I'm sure we had a lot of questions, but I think it'll make sense to just go through all of this first. How are utilities integrating DER into distribution planning process and how it affects the overall process? We mentioned this. This is one where it's a little newer, right? We first took steps to interconnect DER, make sure it's safe and reliable to operate, and now we're taking steps to integrate, really make sure that we're using these DERs to maximize grid benefits for society, including enabling the clean energy transition. So some of the steps, we've started to work with the ISO and other higher level planning organizations to develop different load modifiers and understand how and when we can rely on these intermittent resources, which in the past have really not been counted on for capacity purposes due to that intermittency. That's been a step change we've made. Changing our planning horizons, implementing non-wires, I think is a great success story for New York. It was something I personally worked a lot on and have seen a big step change in the last 5 years. And it was just at a site visit a couple days ago where we had commissioned our first non-wires at National Grid and the first of more to come. So that's an exciting step change that I think the JU has done an excellent job of moving forward with, and we really plan on expanding. And then the last 2 sort of generally building on data accuracy, building on our forecast accuracy. I think Tom Brown mentioned this in his. We are modernizing our grids and continuing to implement things like AMI and more connected devices, and we need to utilize those to better understand our grid, use that monitor and control to more efficiently and dynamically plan. So moving over to future steps, I think our friends on the phone here beat us to it or somehow got a copy of the slides. You saw we want to look behind meters. We want to understand what's going on at residential level so we can more accurately forecast what's electrifying and when and where, who's driving EVs, who's getting heat pumps, who's got an electric dryer, you name it. Very importantly, we need to get to a place where we can do not just more granular DER forecasting, but more accurate DER forecasting. Like was discussed, we're already looking at a pretty much a feeder level when we're doing our DER forecasts, or at least disaggregating the top down. So that's a little less of a concern in terms of granularity, but accuracy, as we mentioned, there's like a ceiling to how accurate you can get given how flexible the queue system is and that there isn't a ton of predictability. So taking the steps we have some through Cost Share 2.0, some through other mechanisms, and continuing to take more steps to find ways that the utilities and the DER community can meet in the middle and help communicate where these systems are going to go so that we can efficiently plan. Those are steps that need to be taken, and I believe that's going to be a central point in our CGPP discussions. That's why we wanted an explicit section on DER forecasting. I won't go through, again, all of these bullet by bullet, but continuing to build ADMS and DERMS and our digitalization of our IT infrastructure is going to just enable more and more of this to be possible. So allowing us to take those steps is going to be a critical prerequisite to enabling some of this functionality. We'll jump to the last slide. Forward-looking, discuss and explain how utilities plan to address the need for additional and increased hosting capacity across the distribution system. One, we want to acknowledge there is a need for more hosting capacity on the distribution system. Our forecasts tell us that, and we know it's a goal we have to achieve. We do want to, sort of lay it all out on the table. The policy environment is rapidly changing, which sometimes makes some of this a little complicated, but for example, right now we don't actually have much ability to rate-based hosting capacity explicitly for the Clcpa Phase 2 order and Cost Share 2.0 orders, but continuing to work with both our community here and our regulators, which is why these types of calls are great, to think about how we can do that is going to be essential. So we're glad we had the opportunity to talk about it today. We feel that there's a need to expand our tariffs. We're very proud of what we've done with the value stack, VDER in New York. We need to continue to expand on some of that localized incentivization and expand it to be more useful for things like storage, where we had so much success with the technology-specific solar rate, expanding that and utilizing it for other technologies. We need to start to look at different ways to plan. This is some of the dynamic planning I was talking about, assessing our system with consideration of peak load, but also for hosting capacity. So whether this is considering non-traditional solutions or traditional solutions, or even some dynamic solutions, schedule type solutions, we need to really have open minds and consider a shotgun approach to make sure we're being as efficient as possible. And towards the bottom here, really, we can do as much as we want in terms of novel programs and IT and you name it, but when it comes to it, especially with electrification, the size of the grid is roughly going to double, just because the electrons moving through it are going to double or more. So there are sometimes no ways around it. There have to be some upgrades built, and we just have to make sure we're doing that in the absolute most efficient way possible to enable hosting capacity. So whether that's considering some higher voltages where we need additional supply and collector stations, or considering expanding our multi-value distribution type initiatives to look at more types of substation equipment and transformers as well as circuits beyond what is just needed for area load growth. So that was a mouthful. I think that's about it. If you jump to the next slide, we have Q&A.
So this is Jason. I just want to kind of do a time check and check with the group as a whole. We do have the one remaining discussion on the agenda about improving transparency and reporting of the planned utility infrastructure improvements. And I didn't know how much time we wanted to try to leave for that, while also trying to field some additional questions from these last couple slides. I'm open to suggestions. Just let me know what you guys want to do. I look at this as being, your meeting and your time to get your questions and concerns out. So I'm trying to provide ample time for both. Do we want to just kind of split it and do 10 minutes additional questioning Q&A from what we just went through, and then try to leave 10 minutes for the last topic?
That sounds good.
If I could just make a quick point. So I did put my contact information and one of my colleagues' contact information for an email. I as far as like a planning and like a holistic approach that I feel you guys are after, just understanding what a DERMS is and the abilities that it has, I think is crucial for your planning situation. So I highly encourage you guys to reach out and just understand the abilities that DERMS can offer, because I do feel there is some misconception just based off the comment. So again, I encourage you to reach out for your own planning sake, and that's all I wanted to say.
Okay, so it sounds like, why don't we allow about 10 minutes to wrap this Q&A up, and we'll try to cut it off at 10:50 and allow the last 10 minutes for the last topic. So I'll open up the floor for questions on any of the previous slides.
This is Mike Fingar from US Light Energy. I had a follow-up question to one of the last slides. It was on question number 2 about the future steps, and it touches on some other areas of the presentation as well. I was hoping the JU could elaborate on the current methodology for forecasting future DER. I know there was mention of considerations beyond the historical data and the interconnection queue, like land analysis and the locational benefit. How is that currently being performed? Is each utility making their own assumptions, or is there consultants being used? And lastly, how can the industry participate in that? The reason being is that available land doesn't always equal DER potential. I think there's just some more factors to consider there.
That's a great question. So I can speak for grids forecasting and how we consider open land. But first, I want to start by saying we would be very open to that. I think, right, most of what our forecasting is, like I mentioned, is just trying to put ourselves in your shoes and figure out what types of decisions you're going to make. I could say we went through a couple iterations where I think at first we built what we thought was a perfect economic model that looked at land cost and interconnection cost and revenue from the value stack, and we allocated all of the solar we felt our portion of the 6 gigawatt target was at the time, using that method, and we actually were able to interconnect a lot of it with not in this scenario without a ton of upgrades, which we were surprised to see. And I think the takeaway we got from that was we aren't factoring enough things in. We're thinking too much like planners and not enough like DER owners. So I would highly encourage forums where you can share those what goes into the planning process, maybe similar calls like this, but with the shoe on the other foot, where we can have an appreciation for how developers make decisions about where to interconnect and apply for interconnection, and that might help us in our forecasting process, trying to guess at where you're going to go. And even beyond that, I think if there's ways we could put procedural guardrails on the interconnection process, as much as that inhibits some of the flexibility that enables value on your end, where that will allow us at the utilities to more accurately forecast where the DERs are actually going to land with some more certainty. That gives us the answer to question 3 here, how utilities plan to address the need for increased load housing capacity, as well as question 1, how we're going to ensure the commission has confidence in our investments. So those 2 factors, I would say. But just to answer your specific question about how we consider land, I think we've done a number of things. One, we've built some homegrown analyzers that use geospatial data to look for open land, and we have worked with third-party consultants and contractors who specialize in exactly that, identifying land for solar development, and they've shared a lot of their models with us, and we've been working with a combination of internal and external tools to build our DER forecast specifically.
Thank you. We could take that back to our industry groups and maybe propose a forum where we can discuss that further. It all makes sense. I think one of the items you mentioned about the societal benefits, one of our biggest challenges is local land use and local laws. I think some outreach from the utilities to the AHJs that you provide service to with those benefits will help us with those hurdles.
That's an excellent point. One place we absolutely agree. As a personal point of turmoil, I've worked on projects that have been defeated for that reason, and I personally understand the terrible feeling it is when some of those things fall through for what feels like avoidable type of concerns. I highly encourage participation in the Clean Action Council's draft scoping plan forum. They have proposed an entire chapter under the electric generation section about how not just the utilities, because we have a certain limited role, but utilities and the state and stakeholders can work with different AHJs or municipalities to move forward and make sure we can meet our goals efficiently, because you're absolutely right. If there's certain areas of the state that are just blocked off for one or another reason, it's just going to increase the cost at which we have to meet our clean energy goals.
Thank you for the response. I'll leave time for others.
Hey, this is Kenny Chandler from NextEra. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. Okay, great. Just wanted to zero in on question 3 on your future steps. The first one, expanding VDER. So I think you're absolutely on the right track there. Love to see if you could unpack that a little bit further. But more specifically, like, who do you need to convince in order to make any changes on the VDER stack, and how can the industry help?
Sure. Some others have thoughts. From my standpoint, there's a number of forums, specifically the VDER proceeding, that there's often either white papers being filed or orders moving around. It's been a little quieter of late. That's generally the forum I think is most appropriate for those types of conversations. But I'm curious if any of the other JU members or anyone from the Department of Public Service has a thought on how stakeholders can get more involved in VDER planning.
This is Andy at DPS. As part of the overall REV proceeding, well, actually within the DSIP part of the REV proceedings, we have a market design and integration working group that's been working for a few years now, working our way through a lot of different questions. And we are currently starting to look very closely at the nature of VDER as it is, and how VDER itself might, what are the possibilities, what are the opportunities for evolving VDER over time, and what would the reasons be for that, and what could be accomplished through it. So that is something that is happening within that particular working group, and I don't know to what extent it might be happening elsewhere, but it's definitely happening there.
So this is Brandon at Dimension. The act has been the point I've been hoping to make in this call since the slide on, which we don't have to go back to, but the slide on kind of the aggregate impact of DERs against peak loads. And I think one of the risks we run here is if we're kind of taking load or generation profiles from resources that are deterministic is not the wrong word, but just saying, well, we're going to deploy X solar because we're deploying X solar, and this is a solar generation profile. As the gentleman from Con Ed pointed out, you're going to get the period of the peak load is going to shift, and the contribution to that peak load is going to change. The commission had the foresight 8 years ago now at this point to try to align these things so that the net benefit analysis that's used for efficiency in those programs and VDER are informed by avoided costs and the time periods that drive those avoided costs. And so, on this opportunity to modify VDER, the commission has had a open and paused, I guess, proceeding on marginal cost of service studies. And I think as we're getting into the midterm review for the New York Sun 10 gigawatt goal, we have an opportunity to reinvigorate that, look at avoided transmission, look at shaping E-value. You know, if we modify the tariff, that's going to modify the load shapes and generation profiles of the resources that we're plugging back into this aggregate load forecast. So I know this is about distribution system planning, but if we're putting the wrong DER assumptions into the plan, we're going to have the wrong amount of spend on capital expenditure. And at the same time, I think we're also going to, like, if we modify the tariff to address the avoided costs and when they are driven by, we're going to get resources that are better suited to do flexible interconnection. So this is a great time for the commission to kind of go back to things that it already had in motion and for the CGPP process to then better DER forecast, make sure that we're putting the spend in the right places in the right.
This is Tom from Grid. I know we got to jump to the next section, but I just wanted to note that we appreciate that comment. But we're definitely actively involved in EMCOS proceedings and would like to continue. And it does have a planning touch point, so I think it is fair to bring up here. There's two ends, right? There's one end is ensuring that we're accurately accounting for those avoided costs, but on the other end, we need to make sure that those avoided costs are actually avoided and that the dollars are finding their ways back into customers' pockets, whether either literally or through some value transfer. So the way we do that is these discussions, right? It's making sure that distribution planners have ways to account for the value that DER, solar, storage, or the combination of both provide to the grid and actually utilize those resources to avoid investments. Because if we have analysis on one hand that's showing a per megawatt marginal value of avoided investment, but on the other hand, distribution planners aren't accounting for solar in diminishing their peaks and avoiding costs, we have a disconnect. So it's absolutely important to continue both on the rate side, figuring out those marginal avoided costs, but also on the planning side, like we're talking about here, to make sure that planners are properly accounting for the value those DERs can provide.
Strongly agree with that. Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. I'd like to try to jump to our last topic discussion quickly. And again, it's been how to better or more effectively report out to the public, developers, stakeholders, the planned utility infrastructure expansion improvements and the projects to increase that. I think it's a very important aspect of the overall process, and I just really wanted to kind of get people's thoughts on it. And I knew, obviously, given the short time frame, I didn't know if we kind of put it out there for response from each of the groups and maybe get some offline feedback on it from either side, or if the industry stakeholders took it back and put some ideas from their aspect of what they think would work best, and be useful from their perspective to provide that feedback back to the JU. Because again, this whole effort that the staff's been working on, since back in the spring, has been to provide the JU with stakeholder input and feedback, so that they're able to incorporate that feedback into their 2023 reports back to the commission. There's going to be a lot more opportunities to provide feedback and comments going forward. Again, the past several months have been kind of the informal process to help the JU gather as much information as possible from the stakeholders. But you know, they're getting ready now, and they should be. We're kind of running out of time for them to start putting pen to paper to be able to start developing those thoughts and putting them into their reports for the future future submissions to the commission. So just kind of putting that out there. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time left to get into an in-depth discussion, but that was my intent for this topic item.
Jason, I could say we'd appreciate that at the utilities, especially if you can, if the stakeholder community here can give us feedback in terms of some of the recent ways we socialized where upgrades are going. I know we're going through the first sets of cost share 2.0 applications, and where we have market-driven upgrades and trying to advertise those to other developers to lower the marginal cost and share the value of that hosting capacity improvement, things like that. If you have any feedback on the way we've been doing that so far, any specifics, we really appreciate it.
Hi, this is Dhruv from Nicia. Like, I'd say, I've been tracking the qualified costing upgrade information, and yeah, I did have a difficult time finding each one since these were located either on hosting capacity maps or JU system portals, or maybe these could be on the places that are easy to maintain. But if we could also host them or put a link to those on the DPS interconnection website or the CGPP website, that keeps all the information in one place, and it even allows us to compare, even standardize those reporting requirements.
Okay, Drew, that's helpful. Do you think Drew or Greg or Zach, you guys could kind of coordinate, taking this question back and put together a more detailed response from your guys' perspective with some input and insights as far as improvements going forward?
Yes, Jason, I'll take this back to the industry and follow back.
Yeah,
okay.
I appreciate that. Just can you just clarify? I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment there. Just so we fully understand what's being asked of us here.
So what I was hoping to do is just kind of, the last question that the topic item that we had planned to cover here, which is, how can the utilities improve transparency in the reporting of their utility infrastructure expansion and improvement projects, so that the developers and the public and associated stakeholders are able to get the information in an easier, more transparent, quicker fashion. Just kind of to help you guys out, get the information that's coming from the JU.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's going to come down to the existing requirements and fulfilling those. But yeah, we can think about what else can be done as well. Do you have a timeline for that on us?
I guess I would, if you let me know what you guys would need, and I don't know if a couple weeks.
Yeah, we'll go back to that. That sounds about right.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Okay. So with that, we're right at 11 o'clock. I really appreciate everyone's time today. A lot of good discussion. Appreciate the JU putting together this presentation. I will post this and the transcript for today's meeting on the DPS website for CGPP efforts. And then I'll kind of coordinate with Drew and Zach as far as that last follow-up item and putting together a response, and we'll share that with the JU and go from there. Any last comments or questions from today's discussion?
I guess
Okay,
I'd be
here.
curious to know, Jason, is there a plan for this group to meet again?
So, I mean, at this point, Zach, I had not. I know, we overall, the intent was to, allow you, the stakeholders and developers to provide their feedback and input. And I think a lot of good information has been shared, and the JU was able to respond to the questions we put together before. And again, the overall effort here is to get as much information to the JU as possible, and hopefully they incorporate as much of that feedback and information into their reports that are due in early 2023. I think we're going to be coming to a point where we need to transition to allow the JU to begin to work on those reports and incorporate that effort. I get nervous that continuing to meet, well, there might not be a bookend there, and I know there's a lot of opportunities and a lot of thoughts and ideas as far as what can be done, but I can certainly say that there's going to be additional opportunity, especially after the actual reports are filed by the JU next year for formal comments and feedback from developers. So this isn't the last opportunity by any stretch.
Yeah, fair enough. And if the perception is that meetings mean that work can't be done in the meantime, we would all, I think, certainly prefer that the work starts. Okay.
Okay. I know we're over time, but one last question is, if the utilities, some of these grid modernization investments, if they're being proposed in pending rate cases, right? Because the DSIPs are not applications for approval of capital expenditures for planning documents like an IRA. So,
can I ask who's speaking, please?
It'd be useful to know that, since I assume that's where that some of these things are being pursued. So maybe that's just a follow-up by email.
I can quickly answer that for Con Ed's perspective, right? Those investments have been proposed in the last few rate cases. ITOT investments, as well as some grid modernization upgrades that coincide with those as well. Those have gone through our rate case.
Okay. So again, I appreciate everyone's time today and good discussions, and we'll be in touch soon. And I look forward for the transcript and the presentation and everything to be posted.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks all. Very much appreciated.